Amazement is an archetype that debuted in Lightning Overdrive, a set that has good individual cards and not so good collective cards. Among the disparate pile of support for established archetypes rest these two, unhelped by any of the other cards, left to fend for themselves, with neither of them being particularly competent on their own, with the topic of this video being the more forgettable of the two, since Warrock would end up with a reputation as being so bad that it's impressive, pointedly in being a TCG exclusive, whereas Amazement wasn't particularly amazing in any regard. Amazement is a trap deck that released a year after Eldritch, so you would assume they've learned some lessons from the Golden Lord. Evidently, the lesson they learned was that they should make trap decks bad, as Amazement would not have the same level of competency in both power nor its own consistency, leaving this archetype to be a footnote among the list of the many trap decks in the game. Amazement would receive support from Dawn of Majesty in the form of Delia and Viking Vortex, then Thrill Train and Power of the Elements, and Abomination Arlecchino and Cyberstorm Access. Did these cards even bolster the deck remotely on their release? No. Did they bolster the deck collectively? Well, you couldn't play 40 cards with the initial release. You can now. Of course, the support didn't make the deck playable, and some of them can hardly be defined as support in the actual sense of the word. That leaves us here to talk about a deck that less than 1/10 of the player base knows about. Hell, I only know about Amazement because they share a secret pack with Abyss Actor and Master Duel, wherein they had the audacity to make Arlecchino the face of the pack, making it seem less like a real archetype that exists, and more like someone's OC that's been forcibly shoved into an existing canon. While Amazement has the same fruity aura as Abyss Actor, as well as the theming of entertainment, it's not quite the archetype that would overshadow it. While yes, Abyss Actor overshadows it in the sense that it's associated with something people actually like, the two aren't really that similar in design. The archetype to truly overshadow Amazement in that regard is Labrynth. When you look at the general design of both archetypes, it feels rather apparent that Amazement was a prototype of Labrynth. I also do think the archetypes might actually just be connected in lore. The fact Arlecchino has 300 less attack and 300 more defense than Lovely is a little too oddly specific to be a random coincidence, especially with the many other similarities that I'm going to cover. It's also hinted that there are more sinister intentions behind getting people to indulge in his theme park. While I don't find it productive to view the deck simply as a worse version of Lab, it is worth going over the many similarities and evaluating how Lab further iterated on the ideas present in Amazement. While it may have initially served as a blueprint for Lab, there's still deviation to root out and take note of. To start, the comparison is in the obvious between Arlecchino and Lovely. Both are the face of their archetypes, as well as possessing alternative forms that further support their archetypes. Although, weirdly enough, normal Arlecchino covers a lot of bases that both Lovely and Lady do, but somehow manages to do worse for it. Arlecchino has a similar special summon condition to Lady, and he sets up a trap like Lady does as well, though he technically does her one better by activating it. The issue that we'll get into with that though, is that their traps are not nearly as impactful activations as Labyrinth's traps are. He has a pop effect like Lovely, but while he can pop more cards than her, it is both harder to activate as well as just worse in overall design. Not being a reactive effect like Lovely's, but rather one you have to activate during your own main phase. That's right, this card that is designed only to really be summoned during your opponent's turn can't even use its disruption effect. The thing a trap deck is entirely built around. And even as a bare minimum of a removal effect on your turn, he has no sort of protection. He can very easily be disrupted himself, as you have to use the effect on an open game state, which is really depressing when you consider both Lovely and Lady do provide protection. Abomination is a card that technically is easier to summon, therefore helps to start the deck's plays, something neither Lovely or Lady really do. But he also doesn't actually start any plays. He gets a crucial trap from the deck, a card with baggage that we'll unpack later, but that's about it. He can tag into normal Arlecchino and reduce a monster to 0 attack in the process, but as established, Arlecchino isn't a high impact summon in this deck. It's just that he's more consistent to summon, and that should have been the bare minimum for the archetype's design on release. this was their last piece of support in Saga, a set that came out 2 years later. I at least appreciate the thematics behind Abomination's design, jump scaring a monster to stun their stats before revealing himself beneath the mask. It's just a shame that attack lowering doesn't really amount to much in this deck, so it's only a cheap thematic flourish. A negation would have made sense for the same theme, but of course, I'd prefer they find more creative interactions than that. It's just a shame they didn't figure out a legitimate alternative. A neat touch to Abomination visually is that the Sheep token and Kari balloons become Scapegoat token and Ghost in the Attic balloons. Lab and Amazement also share the similarity in having assistants for the face of the deck. In Labyrinth, this is in the form of Ariane and Ariana. In Amazement, this is in the form of Delia and Kamika. Ariane and Delia are rather similar in design. Both send a trap to activate their effect, but once again, we have give and take, with the Amazement card being worse while being better in theory. She can special summon herself by revealing an attraction in hand, making her not require your normal like Ariane, but her send has to be from hand or face-up field. It also has to specifically be an attraction card, rather than any normal trap like Ariane. In Labyrinth, the fact the card has to be set for her send cost means absolutely nothing in practice. The deck wants to be playing normal traps, cards you're almost never going to have face up when you resolve her effect. This theoretically translates the same to Amazement, since you want to have your attractions face up. But of course, one of these is monumentally easier to accomplish than the other. Sure, this sets up Arlecchino, but as we discussed, he's not likely to resolve. This is made worse by the fact that while Delia grabs a trap instead of a monster like Ariane, she sets it, meaning you won't be able to use it immediately. The window isn't the end of the world, but the clunkiness between both it and the payoff makes her feel nearly useless. You would think setting a trap from deck would provide a competent play, but of course, you'd be thinking of a deck other than Amazement if that were the case. Even with the capacity to activate a trap the same turn, there's another problem we'll run into soon. Surely Kamika provides more for the deck's functionality, right? When normal summoned, she sets an attraction from deck. Yeah, so she doesn't do much. Ariana searched any lab card, making it so you could set up plays immediately. She also triggered when special summoned, so making her effect trigger on normal summon exclusively makes Kamika far worse than she has any right to be. While they both have effects that provide an interaction, once again, Amazement falls short because of the design surrounding its traps. The last point of comparison is between the two cards Precious Park and Coup Clock. Both cards are designed to allow you to activate a trap the turn they're set, but once again, the devil is in the details. Coup Clock is a quick effect that allows you to activate a trap the turn it's set, and is a hand trap, whereas Park only allows you that window during your main phase, with this also being attached to a field spell. This means any traps set during your opponent's turn are going to be unimpactful. And of course, if you would have liked the flexibility to activate a trap during the battle phase, you just can't. Once again, needlessly making the cards worse for no real reason. If you try to run Park side by side with Labyrinth, since they're both field spells, it gets even more embarrassing. While Labyrinth isn't crucial to the deck's success in play, it provides stronger effects to the deck, making it worth playing, turning your archetypal traps into removal, and your non-archetypal traps into extension. What does Park offer Amazement? Recursion, letting you send a face-up attraction to set a single attraction from grave or banishment. During the end phase, you get an attraction trade. I'd like to remind you, this card's first effect can't be used with this one, just because. You probably wouldn't use it that way on average, but you'd probably think you'd at least have the option to. I'd like to reiterate, the cards aren't bad because they aren't designed like the lab cards to a T, but rather because they have seemingly very little awareness in how the rest of the deck interacts with their effects, as well as having bizarre restrictions that just make them far worse than they have any right to be. Labyrinth's monster design and trap design work in tandem with one another, whereas Amazement feels almost entirely disjointed, struggling to put the pieces together even with all of them in place. Bufo, the last remaining monster name, doesn't really have a direct analog in Labyrinth, although that can still change. Arias, Archfiend, Chandraleer, and Stovey don't really compare to Bufo, but I'll talk about him now regardless, as this might as well be the section talking about all the monsters. Bufo is another normal summon exclusive effect. Not a good start, and his effect is to take an attraction trap from the grave and equip it to an opponent's monster. Both Bufo and Kamika have an effect that lets you change the equip target of an attraction, a unique gimmick that you would think would serve as the backbone of the deck's design and playstyle. But of course, this effect is attached to the deck's two normal summons. Of course, this effect itself isn't their normal summon effect, but if you thought this deck had a way to special summon them, you'd have already put more thought into this deck than the people that designed it. They don't have a way to special summon any of these monsters. They gave that ability to the cards that don't have these effects, leaving the deck with no starters, no extension, and a gimmick that barely works. Lovely. Before we get into the traps individually, it's best to address the fundamental issue with their overall design. For starters, they aren't amazement cards like the monsters. They're amaze attractions, making them a sub-archetype of cards. This is all well and good, if a bit annoying. But because there are amazement spell traps, and the best card is among those, the deck's consistency is made needlessly convoluted. Regardless of this clunky structure, this isn't the biggest issue in their design, because this is at least a setback that can be remedied. However, the functionality of the traps themselves can't be. The premise of the attraction traps is that you equip them to a monster, then use one of its two effects depending on the controller of the equipped monster. A sort of design around ushering monsters onto a ride. Very annoyingly, if it's a monster you control, it must be an amazement monster. Konami absolutely terrified at the thought of you using these generically. Something they clearly shouldn't have been, because it's time for the bombshell reveal. Because of how these cards function innately as traps, the activation of these traps is the equip effect, which means you have to then wait for an open game state after the equip has successfully resolved. Then you can use the trap's actual effect, meaning you have to activate them preemptively in order to use them. I have bad news about how the element of surprise works. Traps are considered too slow for the modern game most of the time. So, for Amazement's design to go out of its way to make them even slower, it's really an art form. This is where we go back to revisit the design of the monsters. Arlecchino allows you to get a trap live right away so you can actually use its effect in time, but no other card in the deck does this. So every trap that isn't played by his effect is condemned to being slower than the average trap, and the overall power level of said traps does not warrant this design. Then there's Bufo and Kamika's effects to shift the target of an attraction. If you didn't think things could get worse, I'm sorry to inform you, this is Amazement. This roller coaster only goes down. Because of the restrictions on the traps, they're designed to only allow you one of their two effects per turn. So their shift effects can only be used as just that, a shift of control, meaning these traps manage to be even slower. It's truly impressive how miserable the design of these cards is. But even if you could use both effects, the existing cards only tend to have one remotely useful effect, if that. So the choice isn't really a choice anyways. So if anything, Amazement is actually a worse Vanquish Soul. The effects of all the traps are based on different archetypes, just like the attractions themselves. Although Thrill Train takes creative liberties since it's based off Metal Dragon, a random fusion vanilla with no background to work off of. This may be cute on paper, but it means none of them end up contributing to a coherent playstyle. And since the monsters don't do that, none of it works. Now it's time to actually start talking about the traps themselves, going from worst to best. The worst of the worst is Wonder Wheel. If it's equipped to your monster, you can bottom a card in hand to draw a card. Card Trader, cool. If it's attached to an opponent's monster, you can send them to Ojama country. Swapping your opponent's stats around can fulfill a purpose, much in the same way that a car with no brakes can. But we'll have to save car crashes for our next attraction. Rapid Racing has you change the battle position of the equipped monster to then activate one of two effects. If the equipped monster is yours, you can shuffle a card from your opponent's grave back into the deck. If it's equipped to an opponent's monster, you can increase the monster's level by 1. The position changing is clearly meant to reflect drifting. It's present on Test Run, and the level modulation is an omnipresent part of FA's design. Considering how dysfunctional the deck is, it didn't need either of these niche effects. But even if the deck was functional, this card has too much going against it, even in the scenarios where it's useful. Graveyard Disruption is neat, but it relies on you waiting for an open game state to activate this effect. You can also activate it early, but as established, Interruption becomes less effective when your opponent knows it's coming. The same thing goes with the level modulation. You'll likely fail to even resolve either effect as a meaningful disruption. So this card has to be one that you have activated by Arlecchino, and it certainly isn't a payoff that demands that importance. Next on this list of defunct attractions is Majestic Merry-Go-Round. It's based on one of the most unbalanced cards in the game, Gateway of the Six. So what effect do you think they chose to copy from the card? The search effect? Maybe the reborn effect? No, they chose the 500 stat buff. If it's equipped to a monster you control, it gains 500, choosing to make it a flat 500 buff, but a multiplicative debuff if equipped to your opponent's monster. You know, a multiplicative buff could have been their means of translating the fact Gateway isn't once per turn, but they couldn't even do that right. It wouldn't exactly make the card worth playing if it did, it just makes its design more insulting that they didn't. I don't understand the reason they chose to make the design incongruent. It's likely because they realized a single 500 debuff was too pathetic to put on a card, but insisted a multiplicative buff would be too good to put on a card. This decision is made all the more confusing because this deck has 3 cards with attack manipulation, but none of it is channeled into a payoff. So why is it on multiple cards? The weird inconsistency wouldn't matter if the deck actually did something based on stat changes in general. But since it doesn't, it only makes it stand out as another weird, unnecessary balance restriction. The trade-off for being a flat number is seemingly that it provides protection for your monster. Good thing the only card that can activate this from deck puts it on your opponent's monster exclusively. Sure, you can shift it with Bufo or Kamika, however the concept of timing exists. You have actively given your opponent a massive window to out it. Originally, I considered Merry-Go to be worse than the previous two, but it at least has a silver lining to it. The saving grace of this card is that it can at least fulfill a purpose on activation, unlike the other traps, only needing the equip activation to resolve in order to provide the protection effect. It's just the fact that a trap card that protects a single monster isn't exactly high value. Viking Vortex is a roller coaster of emotions. If it's equipped to your monster, it can negate an attack. Then, you give your opponent the equipped monster until the end of the battle phase. This could theoretically be a cool way to make use of both effects, having you shift control of a monster to get all of the other effects live. But the deck is specifically designed so you can't do that. Even if you could, this is attached to an attack negation, so the window to do that makes it far less impactful. Its effect when equipped to an opponent's monster may sound good on first read, but of course, this is Amazement. It gets worse every time you read it. When the equipped monster activates its effect, it gets bounced. It sure would be a shame if 90% of relevant monster effects activate on summon, you know, the window where you won't be able to activate this. It can, of course, bounce monsters with other activated effects, but if that was relevant, Ghost Ogre would see consistent play, leaving it to be a worse compulse. Which is sad when you remember Lab has a better compulse. The most annoying thing about Viking Vortex is, it's the one card where directly adapting the effect of the archetype was a good thing to do! It's clearly Liss, but instead of being a negate and destroy, it's a bounce that misses timing in the literal sense, not the game mechanic sense. And when we get to another attraction, it becomes apparent they really made it worse for no reason. Thrill Train lets you reset a trap from grave if equipped to your monster. Of course, Bufo already does that. Actually, he doesn't do that. I keep forgetting he attaches the trap he recovers. It couldn't have just been an option. This deck fucking sucks. So, for some reason, they had to make it worse, and your opponent gets to choose the trap instead. I just love design that portrays functionality for the sake of thematics. However, Unlike every other trap so far, this card has an effect that actually will do something that could be considered useful. If equipped to your opponent's monster, Thrill Train lets you SP Little Knight the equipped monster. Despite that, this card is still annoyingly designed. It's equipped to the thing that is being banished. What do you think happens when it resolves? Oh, it's okay. Remember? Kamika and Bufo have quick effects that let you change the equipped target. That way you can activate the banish, then quickly keep it on field by switching the target. You're right, that's a cool and great use of the deck's core design. However, that's not how game mechanics work. If you activate its effect while it's attached to your opponent's monster, and you swap it, the banished target is now your own monster. Uh-oh! So, why couldn't this have just been a hard banish effect? It's not like a telegraph banish on a trap card is gonna break the game. Why did they have to make the target come back if you're always going to lose the trap regardless? This card was printed in Pot, by the way. Don't forget that. You can't really loop this with another copy of itself. Sure, if you only have another copy of it, your opponent can only give you that second copy, but you can only use one of two effects per turn, and Bufo's cycle effect is already restricted to just his normal summon. It's just another example of needlessly making the cards weaker than they have any purpose to be. Now we get to the two good attractions. Though of course, good comparatively. Cyclo Coaster lets you pop a spell trap if the equipped target is your monster, emulating Nephthys' back row removal, but instead of a duster, it's an MST. Sure, that's fine, it's a niche tool, but far less so than Rapid Racing. And unlike Rapid Racing, it has another effect that actually makes the card useful. When equipped to an opponent's monster, you can add an Amazement monster. Of course, this is Amazement, so it also has to send itself, so you can't use it again next turn. Because a card that could give you a search both turns would be too much for this deck. Man, this really is just a worse Vanquish Soul, huh? Cyclo Coaster is a card that should be the lowest bar for the attraction design, yet it's basically the top. It has a niche effect paired with a generally useful one. This way, the card always has a use, while giving you a unique tool to use in a pinch. This should have been present in more of the cards, but we're on the second to last attraction, and the best attraction doesn't even get this right either. So it's time to elaborate on why this card still manages to be a step down from it. Simple. The search effect is tied to being equipped to an opponent's monster. The back row removal effect is attached to being equipped to your monster. They put it on backwards. The starter of the deck is a trap card, which is already enough of a red flag. But to make it even worse, it requires your opponent to have a monster to be a starter. So realistically, you can only search a monster on your opponent's turn, meaning there's only one monster you will search. The only idiot that does something in your hand. The deck doesn't have any way for you to give your opponent a monster turn 1. So even if you manage to draw Precious Park and this, you also need to find a way to give your opponent a monster. But you know what? Maybe they were ahead of their time with this design. As turn 0 cards become more prevalent in the game, this effect becomes more usable. Silver lining if you cope hard enough. Cyclo Coaster Search not being accessible at all times wouldn't be the end of the world if it didn't have the entire world resting on its back. There is no archetypal search card in this archetype, so this is their only means of searching a monster with a card you can actually consistently get to. So every facet of its design becomes more and more burdensome than it should be. Our final attraction is Horror House, a card you have to be very careful about the pronunciation of. If it's equipped to your monster, you can negate a monster your opponent controls. That's right, Viking Vortex was robbed of its negate, so this card could steal it for the thematics of being scared stiff. Something it also stole from Abomination. If it's equipped to an opponent's monster, you can flip it face down, emulating Ghost Trick's effects with setting. Also, can't forget, since it sets the card it's equipped to, that means it goes to grave as a result of its own effect. Both effects are actually decent, but of course, neither really help advance the deck's plays. Since Cyclo Coaster is the only one that does, these two cards are left overworked and underpaid, leaving the whole theme park on the brink of going defunct. Now that we've finished talking about the attractions, it's time to discuss the non-attraction spell traps. Amazing Time Ticket is a card similar to Fighting Flamesword. It's a quick play search spell that provides you with an alternative effect to be used as interaction. letting you set an attraction from deck with it being live immediately. However, unlike Flamesword, this card isn't searchable. It is neither an Amazement nor a Maze attraction. You have to draw this card. And to make it even better, this is the only means of searching the remaining spell traps. So you have to just draw them as well. Otherwise, you'll have to use it exclusively to search them. But don't worry, none of them are worth playing. And the only one that is worth playing, Abomination specifically searches. Special Show is their one Amazement spell, and it's just target dodging. You can use it to tag into another Amazement from hand, but you aren't playing this card in the first place. You have to search it with the ticket or draw it, and the card can only be activated in response to targeting. Remember when I said these cards get worse every time you read them? I thought for a second, wait, you can target your own cards with your attraction and proc this, but then remembered this card requires your opponent to target specifically. Why couldn't this just activate when a card targets your monster? You would also lose a trap, which they already want you to be doing for Arlecchino. This archetype fucking sucks! Add to the fact that all the Amazement monsters with on-summon effects are only on normal summon, so this card is clinically designed to be as low impact as possible. If it were more accessible and there wasn't so much clunk around the spell traps, it could be at least considered playable, but since all those issues exist, it's just not worth it. The card that Abomination searches, and is the deck's best card, is Family Faces. It lets you take an opponent's monster that has an attraction equipped to it. It gives the monster you stole a 500 attack boost, but shuts off its effects. They really can't let Amazement have anything, huh? It also becomes an Amazement card. That way you can still equip more cards to it if you want to, since you now control it. This card should be a knockout, but every other design aspect of the entire deck makes this card feel middling at best. Even if you were to use this as a means of removal, you lose all the traps equipped to it. The trap recursion in this deck is pathetic, making the fact that a lot of the attractions go to grave from their own effects feel entirely undeserved. And Arlecchino's effect doesn't really make the loss of traps worthwhile given how weak it is. Bufo is the best form of recursion, but it's only on normal summon. The field spell can hardly be called recursion because it's just a swap of attractions, one that also happens at the end phase. And Thrill Train lets your opponent pick the attraction. Even if the attractions were good, this weak recursion makes it so they can't keep up a grind game, which is the entire goal of a trap deck. And because Family Faces isn't an attraction, none of the existing recursion lets you get it back. And it's the deck's strongest asset. While I don't think Amazement should just entirely copy Labrynth's work, I think they serve as a strong reference point to work off of. Labrynth has much better recursion built into the deck. While it's too late to have the same level of recursion throughout, they could certainly use better tools regardless. A card that sets a new attraction from grave if one leaves the field. Making this not once per turn feels like a must since the deck is going to lose traps constantly. Requiring it set a different trap makes it so you can't just hard loop one trap, but even if it could, it lends well to the inherent design of traps as a proper balancing measure. Something the deck should expand upon is the banishing of traps. Arlecchino is the only card that banishes traps, and there's no real way to get them back if you do. Considering the fact you lose a lot of traps just for his pop effect, which is horribly structured, having a way to recur them en masse at least makes up for the annoying window restriction on the effect. Shifting towards this design could be a good way to actually distinguish Amazement from Lab, having a way to recur banished traps and maybe benefit when traps get banished. Something Amazement should lift from Lab is the furniture. Their design feels like a natural evolution of trap decks, so Amazement further iterating on that would be great. Since Amazement is based around theme parks, instead of furniture, they could be maintenance workers, reflecting how maintenance workers at theme parks are typically kept out of sight so as to not break immersion. Also tying in with the more sinister implications of the archetype. Then, to take the thematics up even further with how maintenance work is typically seen in theme parks, they could be pendulums to represent the out-of-sight function both in scale and extra. For Abyss actors, the face-up extra is the backstage, so for Amazement it could be the staff room. They could even be the means of resetting traps. Just design them to scale from grave or extra if a ride goes to grave, reflecting them getting to work on fixing it, but doing so out of sight in the back row. Then, once the job is done, they go to the face-up extra. Having pendulums be crucial to their recursion does potentially limit them to having 3 back row slots functionally, but I'd like to highlight Special Show once more. While Special Show annoyingly can't bounce them as scales, I think it's an opportunity to expand off its idea for the deck's design, having a new card to allow you to pop or bounce a card in general to tag in an Amazement. You could also provide a separate benefit if you pop an attraction instead, giving more depth to the separation of attractions as a sub-archetype. Another means of differentiating Amazement from Lab is having a card that functions inversely of Lovely, making use of the fact you have traps face up and actually benefit from it. They could also implement a secondary benefit while you have a set. There's even potential to play around with the idea of a specific window being afforded to it if it's only online when you have no face-ups, giving the deck a potential management element in losing attractions to get the effect live during a specific game state, while also providing further encouragement in letting traps fall off. The approach to designing attractions has to change massively. I think the existing ones could be justified as one-ofs at best, save for the only 2 good ones. But even those, I think, should have their design philosophy left in the past. The either-or restriction just does not make sense in a deck that has to work for the ability to do that in the first place. And it certainly has no place in the design if the effects themselves aren't absurdly oppressive or useful to begin with. You could apply the Rescue Ace school of design and just letting them set a billion back row, but that would be an admission that doing that isn't really a big deal, only serving to make the deck look more pathetic instead of actually boosting its strength. They need new attractions, and considering the nature of the archetype is using other archetypes as a basis for them, actually make attractions themed around other trap archetypes. This way, they naturally integrate their strengths into their own strategy, unlike the existing ones that randomly tossed in niche interactions that serve no real purpose to the game plan. There could be a Labyrinth Maze attraction that summons an Amazement like Welcome, but in the context of Amazement, it represents the staff helping you navigate a way out of the maze. While labyrinths aren't mazes, it is both an excuse to have a card called Amaze Attraction Amaze, as well as a chance to link the 2 archetypes as rivals. Arlecchino trying to one-up Lovely and have it as an attraction. I would just hope this trap isn't like Cycle Coaster, where it's the opponent's equip effect. An extremely easy design philosophy to correct is also in that of Cycle Coaster, Thrill Train, and Horror House. I don't know why they couldn't have just made the cards reset themselves upon using their effects. They are once per turns, so even with the ability to reactivate them, you can't use them again that turn. Honestly, these cards should be errata to do that since it feels like a mistake, but since Konami's hesitant to ever use an errata to buff cards, we can only hope they don't keep this up in future design. If I were to believe this was intentional, I presume the intent is to fill traps in the grave for Arlecchino's effect. But if that's the angle, this doesn't accomplish that. Arlecchino's effect is during your own main phase. As the deck is now, there's no way to get traps in grave outside of losing them from field, meaning it's an incredibly slow means of doing so, all for the sake of providing another detriment to the deck. If they really want to expand on using Arlecchino's effect, they'd actually have to design more cards that put attractions in grave. If they were to design maintenance workers in the same vein as Lab's furniture, that's one way to help better facilitate this. Ideally, I'd like to see another card that does what Arlecchino should have in the first place in being a quick effect interruption. But so as to not entirely replace him, it could just be a 1-for-1 banish and pop. This way, if banishing traps does become more prevalent, there's already a clear place to start with in expanding that. The fact Arlecchino summons when a trap activates is another issue. He's hard to get out going first, and much harder to get out going second. Which, if the deck were competent at loading traps in the grave and getting him out, would make him a pretty good going second tool. He still gets washed by a single quick effect, but he does at least force out an interaction as he poses a legitimate threat. Of course, they can always just design a card that changes it to be a quick effect. That isn't exactly out of the realm of possibility. Abomination attempts to make Arlecchino more accessible, but requires you have both him as well as one of the 3 other Amazements you can actually summon. When you consider how inconsistent the deck is and how understaffed it is, that isn't as easy as it should be. So both consistency as well as monster count needs to go up. Arlecchino is extremely important to establish going first, seeing as his effect to equip an attraction is tied to the summon of a monster, leaving him as another card that ends up late in timing. but having him on field from your own turn means he's never late to the show. The equip does happen on summon, so I hope, if anything, going forward, they don't design more cards like Viking Vortex that don't even work with the functionality of the cards, actually designing the effects of traps to do something of value in the context with the window they're able to be activated. This way, Arlecchino's equip effect is actually as good as it should be. Although, I think they should also take note of the attraction's functionality in general. Merry-Go-Round is the only trap that immediately does something on activation. Finding more meaningful payoffs for the activation should be the main priority in designing future attractions. As they are now, they do nothing on activation, which is the most crucial window for them to actually do something. The only existing payoff on that generically is Arlecchino's summon window. But there has to be more to it than just him. Labrynth's field spell added effects to their traps, so the same philosophy could be applied here. Other than having more cards that pay off activation, there should be more cards that have Arlecchino's equip effect. Designing ride staff that equip monsters with attractions, guiding them onto the ride, and fastening them in. If they don't want to just print more Arlecchinos for the deck, they could equip from different areas like hand, grave, or banishment. It'd also help if they could actually equip it to your monsters, making attractions in hand live immediately, or combo with Arlecchino's banish effect to recur an attraction that's been banished. The deck does want you to have Bufo and Kamika on field to provide the attraction hopping as a fully realized game plan, but that isn't very feasible to achieve given you can only get one of them out, if that. The deck needs far more ways to get bodies onto the field in general, but this does come with the territory of designing traps that aren't restricted with once per turn either or effects. That way this element can actually be used effectively. Right now, it serves very little actual purpose, so fully embracing it as the deck's core gimmick makes it stand out. There's also the matter of cards like Thrill Train that I mentioned earlier, where changing the equip target to retain it is actively bad. Designing traps that have a good effect that doesn't cause this sort of misfire and allows you to keep them makes the deck's design far more engaging to interact with, as well as encourages more ways to utilize the effects efficiently. It helps make the usage of the cards feel less linear, leaving games with inherent depth that keeps them fresh. Which leads me into the next point of concern. The deck should have more cards like Family Faces, cards that swap the technical controller of a monster to change the applied effect. This is a really unique way to change an effect on a dime. It's just that none of the existing attractions are designed to accommodate that style. If this sort of pivoting nature was actually implemented well, it could have been a genuine excuse to have the either-or restriction. But even now, I think that'd be overly restrictive to keep. You could also go about this inversely to Family Faces, giving your opponent a monster. This helps you gain access to the opponent equip effects going first. You could also just make cards that give your opponent tokens so you can access those effects, giving the deck all the versatility it needs both in play starting and actual interaction. There's also a chance to have a focus on design around cards when they're equipped with a trap in general. Valmonica uses counters as a means of restricting their link ones to their own deck. Amazement could do the same with requiring a monster to be equipped with a trap, and maybe having higher equipped trap counts for stronger payoffs. Then, just like Valmonica, they could make use of their Snatch Steal effect to then out a monster by linking it off for their own link. This is just one means of doing so. There are plenty of other ways to make use of there being monsters with equips. You can, in fact, Eternal Rest monsters that are equipped with attractions. While I'm not suggesting the deck suddenly have a searcher for it, it's a basic means to view the potential advantages of the equipped nature of the archetype. Kamika and Delia are light machines. The deck is equipped themed. Given current work conditions, I'd recommend joining a union. However, they might be better off starting a new one. Weirdly enough, the newest Cyber Dragon card is an equip as well, and Cyber Repair Plant is one of the few means of searching them, but of course, it locks you into machines, so that throws out Bufo and Arlecchino. But it is a rest of the turn clause, so this could still be an elaborate plan to connect Amazement and Cyber Dragon, though they could just make a Cyber Dragon attraction if they really wanted to. The point is, there's plenty of different ways to utilize the deck's existing equip theme. The last thing I'd like future design to address is the stat manipulation present in the deck. There's not a lot of merit to it as the deck is now. If they had benefits while modified stats are present, it gives a card like Merry-Go-Round more purpose in the deck. The immediate thought I have is making your Amazement monsters do double damage. This way they have a means to close games out easier, but it could be taken a step further. Merry-Go-Round introduces multiplicative debuffs based on your trap count. There could be one that gives a damage multiplier for each face-up attraction, giving the deck an OTK payoff for having assembled every ride, representing leaving after experiencing every ride of the theme park. If they want to make it a bit more intricate, they could have it require that they're all equipped to the attacking monster for it to apply, but I should hope there's been far more meaningful ways to shift attractions then. That way the design makes you work for the payoff, but it isn't nearly impossible to actually achieve. This is just the context of debuffs though. While buffs also do apply in this sense, this is just a means to use it to OTK and deal more damage. Family Faces buffs the monster you take, and Merry-Go-Round also has the ability to boost your own monster. These aren't sizable boosts unless they're on an already massive monster. There could be a play on the dynamic of having higher attack on your own monsters, using it to reflect the adrenaline high from going on rides and making them unaffected by your opponent's effects, as well as potentially indestructible in battle. The indestructible in battle could also apply to your opponent's monsters with different stats. That way you can more effectively wail on your opponent. While Amazement's current lineup of cards and overall design leaves us with a lackluster deck, I hope I've managed to highlight the actual level of depth that's hidden in their design. The door is open for so many different directions to be explored. Precious Park is a place of excitement and wonder. There's no shortage of fun to be had. There are truly endless possibilities. It's only a wonder as to when Konami will renovate it and give us a grand reopening that finally affords people that experience.